when most organizations are trying to track their sales performance, they get caught up in all of these different metrics that they think are truly impacting the outcome, which is their team hitting quota. But the reality is teams don't need to track everything. So when you're looking at your overall sales team's performance, these are the things you should be thinking about.
We have a really exciting announcement for all of our viewers and listeners out there. The new book, Endless Customers by Marcus Sheridan and the team here at Impact, comes out in April of 2025, which is really exciting. But you know what's more exciting? You can go right now, today, to endlesscustomers.com and pre-order your copy. And if you do so, there's all sorts of great bonus content that you're going to get that you wouldn't normally get if you don't pre-order. So again, go to endlesscustomers.com and pre-order your copy today so you can learn how to earn trust and win more business in the age of AI. Welcome back to Endless Customers. I'm your host, Alex Winter, and today we are joined by a managing partner and lead sales consultant here at Impact, Tom DiScipio. Welcome back to the show.
Hello. Good to be back.
Good to have you back, brother. How's everything?
Good, man. How are you?
Everything's good. I am pretty much over winter. I'm ready for summer, but other than that, can't complain.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Same. We're about to get a faux spring here in New England where it's going to give us one day of above 60 and then it's going to go back to below freezing.
Yeah. Everyone's going to get so excited and be ready, and then it's going to kick us right in the pants.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. But then it's boat season.
Oh, I can't wait for that. We're going to have a separate episode about boating. But for now, today, the topic, which is an important one, we hear all the time, we're talking about sales, and we hear all the time in sales that we have to hit our quota, and making sure we get to our quota is the most important metric to measure, and quota this and quota that, and da-da-da. Is that really important? And is that what sales teams should be focusing on, or what should be the focus, I guess, is the question.
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, quota is essentially the end-all, be-all metric of did we achieve success in sales. Mm-hmm. So you got to look at it. You got to focus on that for your individual reps and the organization. But at the same time, it's a lagging indicator. So if you're only looking at your sales quota, it means you're essentially ignoring all the other important metrics and numbers that actually help you reach quota. And so if you're not measuring those things, it's hard to actually manage and anticipate what, if your reps are actually going to achieve quota, which ultimately means you're achieving revenue targets too.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Not just the way that you said that, it's like all these things play into hitting your quota, but you can't just look at the bottom line. You have to also look at all these metrics and all these key indicators that play into hitting those numbers.
Yeah.
So how do you do that? What are some indicators that people should be looking at to make sure that they're hitting their quota month over month and keeping the sales pipeline healthy and in a good place?
Yeah, I think it's important to take a step back and remember that we don't just want to assign metrics for the sake of having metrics. I mean, there are literally bajillion sales metrics that you can measure that sound good or look good on paper and can give you some indication of what's going on. Mm-hmm. But I think ultimately when you set sales metrics as an organization, you want to align it to your sales process. So the first thing that you have to do is make sure you've established your exacting sales process. Like, what are the different steps and stages that you bring a potential customer through to get them to a close? And, some companies have really long sales processes,
yeah.
While some have much shorter, right? And a lot of it depends on, what it is that you're selling. Is it a very expensive item? Does it require a lot of transformation or change within the business? Is it more transactional? Once you've established your sales process and you've set the different stages, then the idea is to align your metrics with each of those stages so you can essentially measure the process that leads you to achieve a quota.
Got it. Okay.
And as you're doing that, again, it's important not to put a dozen metrics at each stage.
Yeah, you said that earlier, and I'm just curious, do you see that a lot where people are like, there's all these metrics that are like shiny and look great, maybe on paper, and for someone who doesn't know, they're like, wow, look at all these data points and data sets. This is wonderful, but like, does it really does it really matter, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I mean, not only have I seen it, I've done it. I've totally made this
Speaking
mistake.
from experience.
Oh man, so many times. And I see a lot of companies do this too. You basically end up in your weekly meeting and you're looking at the numbers and you sort of go blind to the numbers, right? You look at it and you're like, am I actually going to make a change based on what this number is telling me right now? Or am I just reading it for the sake of reading it?
Right.
And I feel like what happens most of the time is you're just reading a number because it's the number you've read every week in your sales meeting.
Yeah, I've been there too. And that you get into the like, this is just what we're tracking. I'm just like going through the motions. It's like doing the laundry, you know, but does it really help you understand if what you're doing is the right thing? And if it isn't, how to adjust for that? And I think that's the bigger question, which is really interesting that you're like unearthing this with me right now.
Yeah. So instead of just simply looking at these numbers and reviewing every week, you have to ask yourself the question, can I actually implement positive change based on the numbers that I'm tracking, the metrics that I'm seeing? And one of the, I learned this from one of our business coaches back in the day, a really great question you can ask yourself to make sure you're looking at the right things is, if you were stranded on an island and you only had one sheet that you could use to understand whether or not your sales performance is good or bad, what are the 6 to 8 metrics that you would put on that sheet?
I love this. That's great. So what are these 6 to 8 metrics? Like, what would you want to see on a sheet like that if you're hopefully on a tropical island somewhere?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I'll take my personal opinions out of it in terms of like what I personally would want to see, but in general, again, you want to align it to what your specific sales process looks like. So some examples of this might be, how many discovery calls are you completing in a given week, right? Because when we talk about leading indicators, at least from a sales side, we'll leave marketing out of this for now.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, the idea that if you can have more of these discovery calls in a given week, the more opportunities you're going to have fall out the bottom week over week, right? That's how you're building your pipeline.
Right.
So that might be a great example. Maybe an example on the trailing indicator side is, or maybe I'm not going to say trailing, it's like right in between leading and trailing, might be the value of your pipeline. So in other words, what is the total value of the deals that are in motion at this moment in time?
Yeah.
So if you have 10 deals and let's say they're all worth $10,000, you've got $100,000 in your pipeline. And so some companies say, in order for us to know that we're going to hit quota, we need to have X value of pipeline for that to happen.
Right. Because usually you know your percentage, your clothing percentage, so you can just do some quick math and figure out like the pipeline has to have X in order for us to hit this percentage. Yeah.
Right. And to bring it back to the stages, like with Impact, we only start to measure our pipeline value at a certain point in our process. And that's usually after we've determined that it's a well-qualified opportunity, right? Because if you measure pipeline value of an unqualified opportunity, is it really something that you can anticipate closing? Probably not.
Right.
So you want to be able to weed those things out before you really start to measure your pipeline, measure your forecast, and it'll give you a better indication of whether or not you're going to hit quota.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So it's really looking at just not pipeline in general, but qualified, like how qualified people are in that pipeline, and where you as a company draw that line for qualification. And if you can usually tell to a degree of like, okay, I think they're going to move forward versus like this person's just kicking tires and it's not going to happen. Because otherwise then you're just inflating the numbers. It looks like, oh, we have $1 million in the pipeline, but only 50% of it's actually legitimate. So you don't have $1 million in your pipeline. Yeah.
And you're wasting your sales team's time, right? Like you don't want your sales team focusing on opportunities that are not going to close.
Right.
And you don't, to your point, want to give the rest of your organization the view that more is going to close than actually is.
Yeah. We've talked about that in the past too. And I think it's the perfect thing to talk about here going off script just a little bit, but like we talk about the value of disqualification just as much as qualification, where like, sure, your sales team might be amazing and your sales team might be able to do the impossible and convert people, but how much is that time really worth for people to ultimately not close? And how much time could you be wasting there where you could be spending it on qualified leads that are actually going to convert and really drive your pipeline forward?
Yeah.
I think that's a big piece that people need to think about. So how do teams do that? Like when you're setting up these confines, you probably have your checklist, I'm guessing, of like, here's how we know someone's qualified versus not. Like, what does that look like? And what would you recommend for businesses out there that are trying to do the same thing?
Yeah, good question. This is where I would probably bring marketing back into the equation, which is how can you solve this as much as possible on the front end of the sales process, which is really the back end of the marketing process.
Okay.
And so what we teach our clients to do is essentially state very explicitly and with clarity who is and is not a good fit for your services. And a lot of that comes with, explaining what pricing looks like and the mindset you might have to be in order to make a purchase with, your company. Or, for example, like we'll take a home builder for example, right? Are you doing a whole home renovation or are you doing just a bathroom, right? Like that differentiation could be time that you end up saving with your reps if you're a company that only does whole home renovation, right?
Interesting. Yeah. That's a good point.
So it's being explicitly clear with this on the front end of your marketing process. And while you're in the sales process, it's always good to have maybe 3 to 5 what you would call qualifiers, maybe written down or mapped out somewhere that you can sort of anchor back into during your sales conversation. You're making sure you're getting those answered as you're going through.
I feel like like what you're saying, I'm picking up what you're putting down, where like the classic sales pipeline is like you lead someone to a close. It's like we're going from A to B, and it's black and white and cut and dry, and it's very linear, which that's not typically how any sales conversation goes if you've done sales. So like, what questions can you be asking, and like what alternative frameworks are there to like help direct people correctly to a place where you know that they're going to convert, but also that's going to help them. Like if we're going back into endless customers and we think about the principles of endless customers, we want to be honest and help people. So how can you do that in a way that's like not just moving people like, here, prospect, now you have to buy the most expensive package that we have. And it's like, how do you really help them and get them in a place where they can talk to a salesperson and have a meaningful conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I think in our minds, we want it to be as linear as possible. And for me, I still kind of look at it and feel like the overall linear sales model is still something that exists today, but the how is different. Like the how you move somebody through that process is very different today than it was, 10 years ago, right? And all that comes back to the principles and philosophies of endless customers, right? The buyer has changed. The buyer has more control. They have more technology and tools at their disposal.
Right.
So if we're, let's say, 100-year-old packaging company, and we're still using the same sales process today that we've used for the last 70 years, it's possible it may still be working, but as your buyers continue to become younger, it's going to be more difficult to sell the way you've always sold,
right? Because
your buyers are just so dramatically different, right? And so when we think about the how, a lot of it does come back to education. Are we actually educating the buyer on how to make a purchase with us or how to not make a purchase with us, right? And build that goodwill and build that trust, whether or not it's with you, right?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I've heard this from Chris and from a lot of people in our company, and Marcus especially, where they say exactly what you just said. Like, maybe we're not a good fit. Maybe this isn't. And I think when you say that as a salesperson, the reverse psychology of that, it builds trust so quickly because you're not just trying to make somebody make a purchasing decision. It's like, I'm going to give you the best info I can so that you can make the decision that you want to make. And it puts the ball really in their court in a good way. And I think that's when you're going to see way better closing rates and way better results with your sales teams.
Yeah. And, when we think about sales performance, a lot of the times we just think about like, oh, how much revenue's being produced. But I want to add the stipulation that like, it's like how much good serviceable revenue for our company is being produced. And what I mean by that is like, are we closing clients that are a good fit for us, that will stay with us for a long time? Are people buying our products that will actually use it and get the most out of it for years to come?
Yeah.
And in sales, a lot of it is all about getting as much revenue as possible. But when we think about high-level sales performance, we want to be generating lots of new clients and new, buyers that are good for our company to have.
Yeah.
Not bad for our company to have.
That's I love what you're saying. And that's a perfect segue into our next question, because it says here that a lot of companies focus on revenue. It's like revenue is the biggest piece of the equation. I feel like for most leadership teams, and when people try to measure and scale their companies, it's all about revenue. But how can you tie that to like a healthy indicator for your sales process versus just like the numbers? And how do you translate that with the sales team so that they have really good indicators to be like, we're driving towards this revenue goal or towards whatever the goals are that the company had set out to achieve?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways you can do that. The first is honestly setting some standards with your sales teams of like, these are the types of clients that we want to work with, and giving them the permission and letting them know like, our company is in a position to where you can do this, right? Because I've talked with a lot of companies, startups to huge companies, and a lot of them base their sales decisions and their growth on like, what can we do right now, right? So that might mean close whoever you can, just get the revenue in the door, and we'll worry about it later.
Right. Almost like the revenue is limiting what they think is possible.
Yeah, or it's not limited at all, and we're bringing on clients, again, that may not be the best fit long term, or
okay, I get what you're saying.
Maybe bringing out people who can't fully take advantage of the thing that we sell and the problem that we solve. Mm-hmm. So it's establishing these guidelines of like, hey, these are the types of clients that we work with at this level and this value, and I want you to attack that specifically. Yeah. Not just go rogue and Wild West and bring on whoever you can.
Yeah.
Now, I know some sales organizations, they don't have that luxury, right? Maybe they have a ton of different types of products, and maybe there's ways they get in from one product to the next, to the next, to the next.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe sometimes they're backed up against the wall and they just need revenue. Right. They're in a tight spot and they just need revenue. So it's like, take whatever we can get, which is understandable, but that might actually not be the right answer.
Right.
Even though it might be the easy answer, it might not be the correct answer. Yeah.
It's a very difficult choice. And there have been moments in Impact's history where we've gone through that cycle as well.
I'm sure most businesses can relate to that.
Of course. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the better sale that you make, the better long-term effect that you're going to have on the business, even if you're feeling a little bit of pain in the short term. So do everything you can to manage that pain, and look at revenue as not oh my gosh, we're going to miss this month. It's, how am I setting up revenue for the long term?
Okay.
And maybe that's the key takeaway here.
I like that. That's very well said. What can sales teams do? And I feel like there might be a misconception, because when you get backed up against the wall and you need to hit revenue goals, you need to hit targets, mm-hmm. you start to fall into that trap of like, just whatever I can get in the door, let's just do it. Mm-hmm. How can salespeople and sales folks start to leverage content and start to leverage different tools, and maybe thinking outside the box a little bit and trying to get out of their comfort zone to ensure that they're doing what you just said, where it's like they're going after the right deals versus just trying to make it happen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, content is such a great way to help your prospects know if they're in the right place, and to help them know if they're in the wrong place. And so instead of having to, be the salesperson that continuously talks about and articulates it on calls, you can use the time in between calls or the resources you have on your website and other places to help prospects know whether or not it's worth it for them to keep going. And eventually they're going to self-select out of your process, in which case you've saved your salesperson a ton of time, and you've ideally set yourself up to close another prospect who might be a much better fit for your long-term revenue targets.
Right. I think that's the beauty of this, and it's something that I learned when I came into Impact. Is I've always known that sales and marketing go hand in hand, and there's always been a division of like church and state in most companies, where sales does their thing and marketing does their thing, and they kind of butt heads a little bit. But when you read Endless Customers and you start to understand the importance of like a revenue squad and working together and helping the sales team create content to do exactly what you just said. So instead of having to hard sell and chase people and do all this extra legwork, you can give them everything they need so they can self-select. Mm-hmm. And then by the time they talk to you as a salesperson, you get to have an awesome conversation and a meaningful conversation. And it's not all the, the dog and pony show, basically.
Yeah. And this brings us right back to the metrics conversation or performance of like, you can measure how long, with the right technology, you can measure how long somebody is in a particular part of your sales process or your stage, right? From like maybe between your discovery call and your solution call, it's a certain amount of time, right? But what if you could accelerate that time using content? And so now you're connecting content with process, with metrics and stages, and you're optimizing pieces of it with the right metrics in place.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I'm thinking now about if I'm a CEO or if I'm a business leader or a business owner and I'm listening to the podcast right now and I'm hearing this and I'm going, I do some of these things and my sales team does some of this stuff and maybe we need to rethink this and we need to like rejigger this a bit. How can they improve their sales process and performance, and like what should they start doing to adjust to make these things more of a reality? Yeah,
you got to write it down.
Okay.
Right?
Is it that simple? You just got to write it down?
I mean, you got to start there.
Okay.
I think a lot of organizations that have, sales teams have probably inherited the sales process from the CEO or an executive at one point that sort of kind of made its way down into the next layer of people.
Sure.
And so a lot of times these are understood processes, but not fully documented, right? So maybe somebody's doing part of it differently than, another rep, and you can actually measure the performance of each one and see who's better, right? And I would argue that the one who's following the proven process better is probably going to have better results. So I would say, first thing to do, look at your process, even maybe go through it as a mystery buyer or role play it with one of your salespeople, and then just document it, write down in different stages, what needs to happen at each stage, what's the name of each stage, and how are you going to measure each, like what metric are you going to apply to it?
Yeah, no, it sounds like the more granular that you can get with it, the better chances you're going to have of success, especially as it trickles down through the organization into your sales folks, because then there's a clearly defined step-by-step, it's almost like paint by numbers at that point.
Yeah, and you can finally see a visual of it. Right? A lot of times you can hear the sales process and go through it, but sometimes you can't actually see what it looks like. So I know there'll be instances where you might write down something and you're saying, why do we have two stages here? Why isn't this one stage? What happens if it was one stage? Or, these two stages are so close together. What's happening in this one versus that one? And can we improve our throughput?
Yeah.
But you can't do that unless you look at it.
You have to look at it. And you said role play. That's a huge piece too, which is really awkward at first. The first time I did a role play, I was like, what are we doing?
It's still awkward.
It can be a little weird. It can. But what comes out of those sessions is astounding. It's pretty amazing what you see and what you learn. And some of these, there's duplicates here. We could merge these two pieces together and streamline this experience or this process. So it's got me thinking, because I'm sure there's people out there listening that are hearing this and are like, yeah, I have some of these problems and I want to fix this. Mm-hmm. But reversely, I'm sure there's also business leaders out there that are like, I've been doing this for 30 years and it's been working great for me, and hogwash, I don't need to do any of that stuff. But I don't know if that's necessarily true. So how can you maybe as a salesperson, or if you're not a higher up in the organization, kind of bring this to the top and try to get people to see how meaningful and important it is to continue to like pick apart or analyze and like continually evolve this process to make it as optimized as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it. It might actually be really hard if the bottom or middle layers of the organization are trying to move this upwards, because what we're talking about here is just a shift in mindset and a culture of the way we've always done it can't be the way that we're always going to do it. Mm-hmm. We have to embrace that buyers have changed and technology has changed, and that people have essentially been taught not to trust salespeople, just innately, psychologically, right?
Yeah.
And so, company leaders have to understand that in order to succeed, their reps are going to have to overcome that trust barrier.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Or they're not going to win.
Mm-hmm. That stigma is real. And so I guess maybe I can direct this directly to you, because I know you talk to a lot of businesses about endless customers that are potentially exploring going on the endless customers journey,
right?
Which really dissects the sales process, the marketing process. It's really revamping. So when you have somebody on the hook and they're like, no, our sales process is perfect, I don't want to mess with it, it's been good for the last 20 years. What do you say in those moments? Like, how do you get a sales leader, a CEO, somebody like that, that's maybe a little stuck in their ways with like, no, it ain't broke, I don't want to fix it. Like, what do you say to them? How do you combat that or have that conversation?
Yeah, well, I don't know if there's anything that I could say to them that's going to get them to change their mind. Mm-hmm. I think it's helping them understand what happens if they don't change, and coming to a self-realization of like, if I don't necessarily have a compelling reason to change, then there's nothing that a salesperson can say or do that's going to make that happen.
Yeah.
So again, this comes right back to the idea of education and meeting your buyers, your potential buyers, where they are, right? It's like, I need to achieve these significant growth goals, or I need these problems to go away. And as a salesperson, it's your job to understand how important it is for that to be solved now.
Right.
And what happens if those problems do go away.
Right.
Only then, if the prospect articulates those things, are you most likely going to get a win.
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, time is flying by. Technology is at a breakneck pace, and the next generation of business people and buyers and sellers are on their way up. So you almost have to make that shift, because if you don't, it seems to me like you're going to get left behind. So how can you establish that right mindset to get people to acknowledge that that's the reality of the situation and that you have to embrace it? Because otherwise you're going to do what Marcus says. You're going to ostrich. You're going to be the bird with its head in the sand.
Yeah.
And pretend like nothing's wrong when really everything's burning down around you.
Yeah. I mean, interestingly enough, I think it's looking at your own buying habits and self-reflecting a little bit. We can remove everybody else from the equation, old, young, new to the industry, old to the industry, but like, what have you noticed that you're doing differently in your buying scenarios? And some people are listening to this going, well, I do the same things. I go to the networking events, I handshake face to face, and great, that's awesome. Like, that should still happen. And frankly, there should be more of that.
Agreed.
Because I miss it.
I miss it too.
Yeah.
I do.
But generally speaking, and I even noticed this with my own habits, Alex, I'm a big fan of playing guitar. And my natural state was to go to Google and, Google things about guitars. But the other day I found myself going to ChatGPT, asking specific questions about guitars in specific categories. And the answer I got was better than looking at a full search page of,
totally
things that I don't know if I can trust are actually the real answer. Mm-hmm. And so self-reflect, look at your own buying habits and things you're starting to do differently as a result of the world around you. And that's a great way to say, oh, I don't know if my business actually addresses the way I would buy something, which could be a trigger for you to make some change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do the same thing. Even with Google now, when you search, the Gemini answer comes up first over any of the results now. So I end up looking at the Gemini answer. If not, I'm in GPT or I'm using some AI tool now, because that's scrolling and clicking through page 2, 3, 4 to find what you're looking for, and you're not sure which links are. I feel like that's an antiquated thing. It used to be amazing. That there was a time not so long ago when that was groundbreaking, but that's the speed of change and what's happening in the world right now. Yeah.
Right. And your business has to keep pace with that, because that rate of change and acceleration is not going to slow down.
All right. So we've covered a lot of ground. You made some really excellent points. Can we tie this back into like, what should the sales teams out there that are listening, like, what are the key takeaways for them? What metrics should they be measuring? What should they be looking at to make sure that they're hitting their quota, hitting their revenue goals? But like, what are those key pieces that they should take away from this conversation?
Yeah. I mean, from a metric standpoint, like I mentioned before, there's hundreds of metrics that you could look at that may or may not have meaning for your particular sales process, your particular organization. So principally, I think there are a few things that, sales leaders, business leaders should be looking at, right?
You're not going to list out all 100?
I'm not going to list out 100.
No? Okay.
No, I'm not even going to give you 5.
Okay. Principles are good, though. I think let's do the
yeah.
high level. That makes sense. Yeah.
We love principles here at Impact and
Yes,
Endless
we do.
Customers. So let's start with the idea, again, that there are leading and lagging indicators.
Okay.
And you can't have a tracking sheet or a dashboard that's only full of lagging indicators or only full of leading indicators. You need to know the outcomes that you want to achieve, and you need to know that you're doing the right things along the way to achieve those outcomes.
Got it.
So lagging and leading, a good mix of those two. Second, you don't want too many metrics, right? Because when you're measuring everything, you're measuring nothing essentially. So again, what are those metrics that you need to track? They're going to give you complete clarity on the performance of your sales team and allow you to make adjustments that you can track, right? You don't just want to make a change for the sake of making a change. You make a change so you can measure or not it did something good.
Totally.
Which might accelerate a deal or decelerate a deal, right?
Yeah.
And the last thing would be around the actual performance of the individuals on your sales team, right? Like, how are they showing up to calls? Are they doing well? Are they doing poorly? And this all comes back to role playing. And so for those organizations that feel like they want their sales team's skills to improve, you might even actually set metrics around how often you're role playing with your team. Because again, what gets measured gets managed. So if you say, you might have a metric around, we're going to role play with each sales team member at least once or twice a week, right? I'd recommend even more than that. But that could be a way for you to make sure you're tracking how your sales team members are upskilling every week.
Yeah. And I just have to say the role play thing sounds silly. And even if you're a pro at selling and you think you have your conversations dialed in, it's amazing what you can unearth just from doing these exercises a few times and how much better you can get. Even though you're already great, you can be even better. So it's just fascinating. I think you made some really great points there.
And what I'll tell you is, for those of you that are avid listeners of the podcast, you've heard Connor Delaney speak before. Mm-hmm. He and I role play 4 times a week.
4 times a week.
So almost every day of the week, we have half-hour to hour-long role plays.
Yeah.
And honestly, I've been in sales for 10 years. I've been at Impact for a long time. I still learn things from Connor every single day, and he from me.
How cool is that?
So nobody's too old to role play.
Right. And there's also overlap too, because the marketing team, us folks, over here in marketing land, we watch some of the sales calls that you guys have so that we can understand the conversations that are being held so that we can make content and shape content around what our customers want and need versus just what we think they need.
Right.
Big difference there.
Yeah.
All right. Closing thoughts. What's the one thing that we should really take away from today's conversation for our listeners and people out there?
Yeah. I think the most important thing and the most actionable thing that you could do coming out of this is to visualize your sales process in stages, in steps, which is then going to allow you to identify the key metrics that you should be tracking, lagging and leading, and ultimately help you reach your sales quota.
I love it. Tom, thanks for all the insights and for being on the show.
Yeah, of course.
Really appreciate it, man. And for everybody out there watching and listening, this is Endless Customers. We'll catch you on the next episode.